Good morning and welcome. I'm here as the historian, but of course I'm also a human being, and I also have a family biography, and I also have a state of mind, as many of you know. Before I go into my lecture about the survivors of the Holocaust, I really suggest very much and favor very much that you see the exhibition. It was really our aim, as funny as it might sound, to bring some fun into Yad Vashem. There is a very optimistic story following the story of the Holocaust. I'm going to speak of this optimism, and I'm also going to say, before I start, that as you can judge by my name, Hanna, which is a very common name to children who had Holocaust in their parents' biography. I don't consider myself to be what is called second generation, but my parents came from the Holocaust, and they named me after two of my grandmother's name, which was Hanna. I'm not sure whether my choice of research is connected to my biography. That is to the psychologist to say. But of course, I grew up, and this is very important for me to say, in a very happy, life-loving family, with a very warm family, and with no anxieties whatsoever. I grew up as a very confident person, although my parents experienced what they experienced, and this is basically what shaped my life philosophy. And this was very important for me to say here. My following words, I don't want to refer to this as a speech or as a lecture, covers one of the most fascinating dramas in the building of Israeli society. I have lectured many times on the multidimensional story of the survivors' absorption in the early years of the State of Israel. I would like to focus today on the 50s and the 60s, the first 2 decades in the Israeli existence. I'll start by quoting some numbers. I think it's very important. And before I say the numbers, I want to state that most survivors of the Holocaust who chose to build their lives after the war outside of Europe chose, and I emphasize the word chose, to come to Israel. They didn't choose, although they could have the choice to go to the United States or Australia. They chose to come to this very difficult homeland, and I emphasize again the word homeland. By the end of the 60s, more than 500,000, 500,000 survivors, immigrants, arrived to Israel, mainly in 3 major waves: 1945 to 1947, 1956, 1957, and of course the big wave of 1948 and 1949, the largest wave. Needless to say that Israel became the largest absorbing country of the survivors. By the 1960s, 1 of every 4 Israelis was a survivor of the Holocaust. It's not only a numerical data, it's also an essential data to my story. We still need research concerning thousands of survivors arriving with the immigration from the Soviet Union in the early 70s and late 80s, but I don't have such a research, so that will have to wait for our next meeting. The absorption process, as it will be described, is one, as far as I know, which is unprecedented in the history of world immigration. It tells a story of a wave of immigrants not part of the founding fathers, that within 1 generation, or even within the actual generation, became the backbone of Israeli society in the widest sense of the word. This conclusion leads me to make a few distinctions before going into a couple of details. Absorption, as it is, has 2 meanings. The first is a material one: income, housing, security. The second is cultural and spiritual, integrating the survivor within their unique message, unprecedented human message and experience. Obviously, this message was painted in many colors as was the crowd of the survivors, who included former camp prisoners, partisans, convent hiders, repatriants, just to name a few. They were not a homogeneous group, and they are not one profile group, which is also a very important thing to remember. They all shared one common thing: the trauma which shook their previous lives, and the fact that they all decided eventually to move to this enigmatic place, to most of them, Israel, which was in the Middle East. To fully understand the profound changes that occurred since the beginning of the 60s, I'll describe briefly the interaction of survivors and those who accepted them in their new country. I, of course, personally denied the word veterans, because there were no veterans Israelis in 1948. Most of them were newcomers themselves. During most of the time, from 1945 up to the late 50s, Israeli society had been a mobilized society. The top national priorities were, of course, defense, settlement, and mass immigration absorption. That's just to give you the numbers. There were about 600,000 Israelis here when the state was born, and they absorbed within 3.5 years 800,000, which means 1.5 times their numbers. And there was, of course, the great euphoria over the newly acquired sovereignty of the Jews. Most survivor immigrants internalized these priorities. I show in many of my research how uniquely in Israel they were the most active immigrants in initiating things. As a matter of fact, they were never absorbed. They practically and forcefully penetrated each available gap in Israeli society. They constitute more than half of the fighting force of the IDF during the War of Independence. This is an amazing data. This, of course, is the wide perspective of understanding what has been called the great silence of the survivors, which I claim never existed. Basically, it was a decision made by the survivors, though not always fully aware of that most of their physical and mental energies should be dedicated at this point in their lives to rehabilitating their personal lives, to building family, and of course, to building the new nation. In the early 60s, and I'm jumping because I have such a short time. In the early 60s, many survivors, immigrants, already settled economically. Moreover, Israeli society as a whole turned from collective orientation to a more individualistic one. In the international arena, Israel internationally enjoyed some of its best years in status, which is the most important at this point in time. 1961, the most important Holocaust trial was taking place in Israel. I refer, of course, to the Eichmann Trial. The Eichmann Trial was this essential turning point which changed completely Holocaust consciousness in Israeli society and, of course, the status of the survivors in it. 110 witnesses, of whom 90 were survivors, took their place one after the other on the podium and turned out to be which turned out to be in the most publicized trial in the history of the state. During more than 2 months, they told a shocked nation their horrid stories in the first-person voice. I, not we, not they, in the first-person voice. By that time, most of them were already materially settled, as I said. Each one had a different story, and together they told almost the complete story of the Shoah in its whole complexity. They told the story of the ghettos, the hidings, the fighting, and above all, the story of the mass murders and the death camps. The social change that followed was profound and multidimensional. Many Israelis learned for the first time new details about the final solution. But what is more important is that the very essence of knowledge changed. One of Israel's laureate poets, Chaim Guri, described this process then very accurately. And I quote, "We did know these things, didn't we? Yes, we did. We knew them before the Eichmann trial. We had Yad Vashem, we had the Museum of the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz, but when this material moved to the prosecution and became part of the indictment, when those documents have burst forth from the silence of the archives, it seemed they spoke for the first time. And the previous knowledge was very different from the current one. This process liberated a huge amount of energy of now I understand and grasp. It was now that the Holocaust took place and not in any other time or date until the beginning of the trial." In Guri's last phrase, which he says the vagueness of generalization gave way to a detailed reenactment of the destruction, we detect yet another change. In all the years after World War II, the Holocaust was grasped in massive concepts, in macro concepts. It was treated as a national disaster, i.e. the disappearance of what was called those 6 millions, the reservoir of the Jewish people and the Zionist movement. Only very few in Israel grasped it on a micro, on a private level, on the individual and his personal tragedy. Death too was visualized until then as a mass experience. The Eichmann Trial forced Israeli society to view the Holocaust through the eyes of the individual, real, touchable human being, who is an separable part of Israelis, be they kibbutzniks, city people, intellectuals, blue-collar laborers. This process had two very powerful effects on the attitude towards survivors. First, there began a process of soul-searching as to how they were accepted by the Israelis. Could we have given those people more than we gave? It was asked. However, a distinction was drawn between the Israelis and those who had been there, and this time it was not judgmental. No, I don't compare, I dare not compare my suffering here to 1 second of horror and pain belonging to those who were there. Quotation. As a result, Israelis gave now legitimacy to a process that does not permit any criticism concerning Jewish conduct in Europe during Second World War. I like to refer to this process as one in which the survivors turned from sheep to the slaughterhouse, as it was referred in the beginning, to the holy sheep. The changes in the amount of knowledge, in its essence, in the concepts of the Holocaust and attitudes towards the survivors were among the immediate results of the trial, though they would also have a long-range impact. But the trial had one more important aftermath. Among those affected by the trial were many young Israelis, those born after the war, many of whom had no feelings for the diaspora, many of whom were of Asian and African origin, where the Holocaust was not even part of their parents' biography. Thus, the Eichmann Trial became a shaping experience in their adolescent process. Most of the prominent people in Israel's public life today, and this is a very good key to understanding Israeli life, are those youngsters, which provides a very profound clue to a better understanding of Israel today. The ways in which the whole Israeli system coped with the shock of the trial left also a remarkable impact. The years from 1963 and on are marked with a deepening consciousness of the Holocaust and a profound change in the public status of the survivors. From the end of the Eichmann Trial, Israel mobilized many of its systems to strengthen the trial's effects and turning them into long-range ones, I must say, with great success. From the many facets of this process, I'll relate to only one because I don't have the time. As a result of the trial, many survivors had now open channels to Israeli elites. Some of them used it to foster initiatives aiming at deepening the knowledge of the Shoah among youngsters. One of those involved sending youth delegations to Poland. This started in 1963. The aims were defined by the survivors as demonstrating to ourselves and the whole world the continuity and identification of Jewish youth with the murdered Jews of Europe. End of quote. Moreover, another quote, it is the most effective way to teach them an awareness of their Jewishness. End of quote. This is very interesting. It was the first time that the emphasis was on Jewish awareness rather than on Israeli. Moreover, this awareness was connected with the Shoah. Undoubtedly, this marks the beginning of a process in which the Shoah is becoming a dominant part in the shaping of Israeli national identity. This process involved a growing sympathy towards European Jews in general and to a great extent, which is a great extent due to the survivors that process the accepting of the diaspora, and the accepting of the diaspora began. The birth of the State of Israel no longer was conceived as a break in Jewish history, but rather a part of it. Historic continuity was re-established. The same process was apparent in the project aimed to immortalize Jewish communities, which I will not go into at this point. To conclude, and before I conclude, a very systematic conclusion, I would like to say one personal word to you as educators. In the life of the survivors, there are three chapters. One chapter is the life before the Shoah, which is, in a way, I call it the creation, the cultural creation and the cultural impact of the survivors or of the European Jews in Europe and in their homes. These are their family stories. This is the great impact of European Jews on their cultures. The second part is, of course, the part of the Shoah, the core part of the Shoah. The third part is what I call the day after. I want to say something very unorthodox and maybe something that will surprise you. As an educator, and I consider myself as an educator, as I learned from my teacher, Yuda Bauer, the Shoah is unlike any other chapter in history, and you should not teach it as a regular chapter in history. The first chapter and the third chapter are the most important for education, not the Shoah proper. I don't see, and by the way, what I'm saying now is instead of my conclusion, because I understand my time is over. The Shoah and the learning of evil has nothing to say as an educators. Evil is evil is evil. I don't see any lessons in evil. But what the Jews created in Europe is the essence to understand what happened in the Shoah. The wiping up of a Jewish civilization, and it was a civilization, without knowing what was this civilization, you cannot explain to our students what was lost there, and you cannot make them understand what the Shoah was, because the Shoah was not the gas chambers. And I, for myself, and I do it in my way, think that the day after is the most important lesson. Because The question you should ask is, what do you do with such a mega terror disaster? What energy you draw out of such a lesson? And me, for myself, I take the answer from the survivors. And the survivors didn't speak so much about it, but they did. And education you do, you don't speak of. And the survivors, after the war, decided, maybe not as a Bible, but they decided by their actions not to draw any energy on vengeance, on destruction. They decided to take all the energy drawn from the disaster and put it into building. And they built a state. And they are actually the backbone of this state. The culture of Israel, the Israelism, was modified and created by the survivors. Even the Hebrew language was, in a way, modified by the survivors. So they came here. They created families, of which some of us are the result. They built up a nation, and they helped and did shape its culture. I do believe this is the essence of the discussion of the Shoah today, actually in this very generational crossroad when we are about to say goodbye to the generation of the Shoah and be left without them. My last sentence I want to read. We are what we are as a result of this combination of Israelism and the Holocaust. In the current generation crossroad, it is my strong belief that the message of the survivors is not verbal, but rather what they did. Accordingly, the educational emphasis must shift from plunging into evil, sometimes the pornography of evil, into answering the question, what is it that you do with a huge catastrophe? Is it revenge and destruction, or rather redemption and rebuilding and creation? One strong answer was given to this question by the survivors, and especially those who came to this country. Thank you very much.